Laura has some items here that she wants me to announce. The first is January 11th, History Shaken and Stirred. It's our second iteration of that event. Will be the untold stories of Sykesville's Freedom District, January 11th, 6 to 8:30 at Covalent Spirits in Westminster. Some of you attended the first History Shaken and Stirred. It was a fun event. These are little 3 to 5 minute stories that we share, history stories that we share at Covalent Spirits. And Lynn, you want me to acknowledge Matt, I imagine? Pastor Matt? Yep. Pastor Matt, did you want to say a few words? Or okay.
We are so thrilled to be able to have this beautiful partnership with Grace Lutheran. And Pastor Matt, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Hey, I just wanted to welcome you all to Grace Lutheran Church. It's great to see you all again. Merry Christmas to one and all. This guy looks pretty well rested, so we're glad to have him back. Relatively, you know. But thank you very much for being here, and enjoy your lunch and enjoy the talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we also have January 20th, Carroll County's birthday celebration. It'll be of the history of the Lehigh Cement Company, 100 years. That should be a fascinating presentation. Next, BLT, I believe we have Galen Root, right, Lynn? Talking about the old Westminster High School and sharing stories from that, I guess, from the high school. Okay, so we'll have Galen here next month. And then please bring your Christmas cards to the Society to be used next year for the holidays. We have a project plan. Names and sentiments will be removed from the cards. And also, please note, we'll be installing the Tawnytown exhibit, the Ag History exhibit from Tawnytown's Heritage Museum. That's going to come to the Historical Society, so it's sort of an exhibit on loan. And I believe Laura mentioned to me that we're going to be installing that over the next few weeks. So we'll put an announcement out on Facebook and on the e-blast for everyone when that's installed. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Judge Brian DeLeonardo has served as judge for the Carroll County Circuit Court since 2021. Prior to that, he was the state's attorney for Carroll County, a position he held for 6 years. Judge DeLeonardo graduated from Towson University and the University of Baltimore Law School. After graduation, he served as a law clerk for Judge Charles Moylan and worked in the Maryland office of the Attorney General. He was in private practice from 2004 to 2014 before being elected state's attorney. He is a member of the Maryland State Bar and the Carroll County Bars Associations. He served as president of the Maryland State Attorneys Association. In his role as state's attorney for Carroll County, he was also called upon by the governor to serve on numerous task forces and commissions. He is past president of the Reisterstown, Owings Mills, Glendon Chamber of Commerce, and served on the board of directors of Carroll County Youth Services Bureau. And I know Lynn is thrilled that he regularly serves as MC for the Battle of the Books campaign. So can we have a warm round of applause for Judge DeLeonardo? Thank you.
Well, I often say when I've done Battle of the Books for the kids, and then I did recently Battle of the Books After Hours, which is for the adults, I often noted that the adults were less behaved than when I would go to the kids, but I presume you will all behave today. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak today, and you heard a bit about my background. When I was asked to do this, first of all, I was very enthusiastic. I love the courthouse. I love the history. When I was appointed and I found out that my chambers was going to be in the historic courthouse and that I was going to be presiding primarily in courtroom 1, which is the historic courtroom, that was a tremendous thrill for me because of the history that goes along with that. In fact, when I was a brand new prosecutor working in the Carroll County State's Attorney's Office after I had graduated and clerked for Judge Moylan, my very first jury trial was in that courtroom in front of Judge Arnold, who was presiding at the time. So my tie to that courtroom and my love and admiration for those that have preceded me makes it certainly a privilege. I want to start off, as any good lawyer does, and give a few disclaimers. My first disclaimer is I'm not a professional historian or experienced in this area. I am simply someone who loves this area of the courthouse and its history and finds it fascinating. And so really my desire is to hopefully share some of that enthusiasm with you and really put together in one location so much that I've learned for so many different people along the way. The other disclaimer I will give is every one of these areas that I'm going to touch on in this limited presentation, I could probably spend a full day on. One of the things that is challenging in going through this is it is very easy to go down a rabbit hole. And I will get into an area and it becomes incredibly fascinating, and 3 hours have passed by and I forgot what I initially was looking into this area for. So I recognize that there's so much depth to each of these areas. I could spend a full day, for example, on just the prior uses of the courthouse. But I recognize this is an overview. The next thing I want to do before I start is give some thanks. And I mean that because I am merely the latest in the judges that are here and been working on this. And I have had the benefit of the information and feedback for this presentation from many of those. Senior Judge Joseph Getty, I know that you've heard from in the past, has a lot of history and work that he's done in this area, and I was very privileged that he was willing to look at this and also give feedback, and I've used a lot of his information. Senior Judge Tom Stansfield, who was the judge that I took his spot when he had retired, is also, he's like living history and what he knows about this courthouse, and also was helpful in this presentation. Flossie Barnes, who is the librarian, has been the librarian for the courthouse and law library since 1979, is an incredible wealth of information and certainly was helpful. And then I have to give great thanks to Dana Ritter, who's here today, my judicial paralegal, because she did a tremendous job in taking the information and creating the visual today, as well as doing her own research. She spent a lot of time looking through the Carroll County Times from 1880s. Let me tell you, it's an undertaking. I even noted Kevin Dayhoff, I see him here today. Some of his work we used and based it on. So if there are any mistakes in my presentation, it's because I relied on Kevin Dayhoff for some of my work. I say that because he's a good friend of mine. So let me begin a little bit about the courthouse and some of the origins. The thing about the historic courthouse that is something, frankly, as I got through and began this process when I got in, and this has been a goal since I got there, is to put some of this information together. The first thing that was really fascinating to me is that the courthouse, the history, when we talk about it, it's not really just about the courthouse, but the county overall. So first of all, if we remember with Carroll County, and ultimately with it being established originally, being established in 1837. Now, ultimately, that resulted from legislation that had passed, and the original legislation that was passed in 1836 provided that there could be a levy of no more than $20,000 to purchase land in Westminster and to build on that land a courthouse, a clerk's office, a registrar's office, a jail, and a poorhouse, which were supposed to be for residents down on their luck, that they would always be able to be provided a place to stay, as well as a meal. Well, interestingly enough, that poorhouse, and this is what I mean by things go off on a tangent, ultimately wasn't established until 1852, and that ultimately turned into the Carroll County Farm Museum today. But originally, if you can imagine, $20,000 was going to cover all of those things in Westminster. So to say there's been inflation since that time, it's a bit of an understatement. Now, what's really fascinating to me is, although that was originally done in order to create a courthouse, the actual first meeting that occurred, and this was with the circuit court, the orphans court, and the county commissioners, that first meeting was in April 3rd of 1837. And court was called for the first time by Chief Judge Thomas Dorsey and Associate Judge J. Kilgore. Now, in holding at this first court session, the court appointed James Kiefer, who was the court crier, and they also had a clerk, and Nicholas Kelly was elected sheriff. It's interesting because in that time, and though that was the first court session, the court was not complete until, ultimately was not completed until many years later. So all the other meetings of the circuit court were held in the Union Church after that. But the first meeting was at Cocky's Tavern. Now, from there, the very first session of court after that first meeting was held on September 4th of 1837. Again, that first session was presided over by Thomas Dorsey, the chief judge at the time. He was also the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. So at the time, there would be a chief judge for each circuit in Maryland. And each of those chief judges would also serve as a judge on the Court of Appeals, which is an interesting issue. We don't do that obviously now, but at the time they sort of served from each area, and then when they were called for appeals, they would all sit as the Court of Appeals, which is now our Supreme Court. At that first court hearing session, there was 13 grand jury presentments, and there was 4 of those were for selling liquor without a license. So apparently that was an issue for those before we had a court. Now, the first criminal case. It is very difficult in going back and trying to find certain information, but we were able to determine. Now, one of the things we were able to find is there was the address of the Honorable Francis Neal Park. And I'll talk to him a bit later, but he gave a presentation in January 19th of 1937, and he talked about the first criminal case. And this, as I indicated, was before the courthouse was actually constructed. At the time, the defendant was George Ramby. He had been charged with assault with intent to murder and 3 other counts. The Deputy Attorney General was William Malsby, who you will hear in some other cases. Ultimately, Mr. Ramby was acquitted of the crimes charged under the first and second counts, but he was found guilty under the third and fourth counts. He was ultimately given a fine of $5 and 60 days in jail. So we don't know how he did on probation after that, but apparently that was his penance. But we know from the first criminal case was starting as of that time. The new courthouse. Now, ultimately, the new courthouse, they ultimately were able to determine a site. The commissioners were able to do that. It was determined by, at the time, 9 commissioners. The land for the courthouse was donated and given by Isaac Shriver, who operated a tavern nearby. When I talked to Judge Stansfield recently about this, and again, some of the oral history we're going to follow up, he told me that there had ultimately been a legal dispute over the land and the deed that had arisen out of this because there was an heir that had not been included in the process. And so ultimately there had been some legal dispute that followed. But ultimately on June 13th of 1838, Andrew Shriver laid the cornerstone of the historic courthouse. And there was a large festive military and civic ceremony. And of course, you can imagine at the time, this was the building. This was a huge building, ultimately, that was going to be constructed. And it was constructed for the lofty price of $18,000. It consisted of a center portion of 2 stories. There were 7 bays and a gabled roof. There was an ornamental cupola and you can see, ultimately, the steps in this area. So this was a picture that we'll actually have included later as well, but one of the early drawings or depictions that we have, and I'll talk a bit more where we got that from later. After the building had finished construction, the officials set to begin their work. Now, we did note Andrew Shriver. We were able to find a picture of him. There's actually a very fascinating story with him regarding him and his brother living in Union Mills, and one supported the Union and one supported the Confederacy. This is what I mean by going down the rabbit holes, and I got very interested in that, but that's not the purpose of my talk today. James Shellman, and again, this is something that I will blame on Kevin Dayhoff. He now conveys to me that it wasn't the first mayor, but it was the first Burgess. Is that correct? But in any event, both of them were involved at the time. This is one of my favorite photos, actually, and this was an early photo from the interior of the courthouse. So in this photo is is Dr. Frank Shaw. So he was actually elected clerk of the court in 1873. And you will see that he also served as the state tax commissioner. So in this photograph you can see him sitting on the far right, back inside the courthouse. So at the time when the courthouse was originally there, it was used for a variety of things. It included the commissioners. It included the tax office. It would include any kind of governmental functions that there were actually in the county at the time. It would also be used for a lot of other things. There was private business that rented out space. There was a photographer that rented out part of the courthouse for a period of time. And so when you realize what all actually took place. Now, some of the early additions, in 1882, the one-story wings were attached to the center portion for the price of about $12,000. And in 1935, the wings were rebuilt and made larger to make it a half story. The floors and the steps inside the courthouse and in the foyer, which I'll show you later, were quarried in Harford County and brought over. The furnishings in the courthouse, and I'm going to show you a lot of those, are original, except some of the ladder-back chairs that were used for the jury were later replaced to Windsor chairs in 1937, and they sit in my courthouse as of now. And I have full jury trials with them sitting in those chairs, which is really amazing. So with some of the other updates, in 1956, in addition to the judicial branch, the courthouse housed, as I indicated, the court commissioners and other offices, and as well as rented out to other places. There's interesting stories that we've discovered over time in looking through articles and newspapers. For example, one of the early years of the county, the one room on the second floor was leased to a local photographer, Henry Grammer. So I guess maybe he was responsible for some of the photographs that we did get in the interior. It is also one of the things that we found as a result of the research that was really interesting, that in 1850, a Native American exhibition was held in the courtroom for a rental fee of $3. And I'm describing from that historical reference. The exhibition was a full-scale war dance, and county officials were so alarmed by the dust it raised that after the exhibition, they decided to limit the activities that could be held in the courthouse. So you can imagine this was a center of the community, and it generated, at times, perhaps much more than today, even everyone's attention with what took place there. And eventually in 1977, Courtroom 3, which I will show you later, was replaced a portion of the clerk's office. And then in 1986, what was Courtroom 5, there's two areas in the first floor of the courthouse that are now used for courtrooms. That ultimately was established, and it replaced the Orphans Court and the Register of Wills office. So you'll know that eventually that we have what's called the courthouse annex was built. And so originally when that was done, you had the commissioners leave and move to that area. You had a lot of other courthouse or governmental functions leave for that area. So the courthouse sort of grew and it became more all functions of the court. Now, Carroll County judicial elections, the first judicial elections in Carroll County was in 1867, which was a few decades after the courthouse was built. And the first judges that were elected in Carroll County in the 5th Judicial Circuit are listed here. Since that time, this is the list of all of the judges that have served. I was number 27 in this list, but when you think about the history that is here, the fact that there's, in my mind, really only been 27 circuit court judges is kind of amazing over that period of time. But that is sort of the list that we have now. Now, as I move into discussing more, remember, at this point we had the court established, we had, and again, another rabbit hole I could get down, which is we had the jail, and we had a lot of that was commissioned and had been built and was proceeding. But I do want to acknowledge that we still had some terrible incidents, one of which I know has been well documented through the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, the Carroll County Coalition of Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. And that was really this particular incident that occurred in 1885 with Townsend Cook, who was 20 years old, had been accused of rape by a woman in Mount Airy. And after the assault, this knot had went to her neighbor's house and given a description, and ultimately Mr. Cook was determined to be the assailant, and he was apprehended, although he denied the crime. He was taken back to the home where the victim identified him as the assailant. And so ultimately he was arrested and transported to at the time, the jail in Westminster. At around 1 a.m. on June 2nd, approximately 40 men wearing masks broke through the front jail door and placed a rope around his neck and dragged him to an open wagon. Reportedly, based on what was described, half the town was present, and he was hung from a white oak tree near the road. And he was also shot twice in the neck. The lynchers had nailed a note to the tree claiming he had confessed to the crime at that time. I note this because although this coalition has done this research, and I think ultimately there was at least 38 lynchings in Maryland, the one in Carroll County was Townsend Cook, and it puts the time frame of when this is happening. You had the evolution of court, you had this going, but obviously this was not through a court process at all. It was done as a lynching. I think it's important as I move to one notable case that I wanted to highlight for you was the trial of Solomon Sudler. This is a really interesting look into what was a judicial process at the time, and this was in 1916. On the evening of New Year's Day, Solomon Sudler, and we've seen conflicting information. One indicated that he was 18 years of age. In other news reports, we saw that he was 16 years of age. But in any event, he was accused of murdering William Brown on his farm in Silver Run while he was milking. He was ultimately captured, Sudler that is, was captured in Cumberland and taken to a jail in Baltimore, and a grand jury was convened, and he was indicted for first-degree murder. Now, what's fascinating about this is when we talk about speedy trial today, let's just say we go at a much slower pace than they did then. This trial initially, this happened on New Year's Day, and they arranged him a speedy trial on January 24th. Okay? We do not do anything that fast in court anymore. I would say more commonly now for a large case like that, you're talking probably at least a year and a half, sometimes longer. But they had a speedy trial. It's interesting from the description of the reports that on that date they described, the Times reporter did, as the largest crowds ever that have showed in Westminster that filled the streets and filled the courthouse. So this was an event, a major event in the community. That day, I've told you about Chief Judge Thomas. He was actually ill and the trial was postponed, but not for long. It went from January 24th to February 14th. and trial began that day. It was described that the courthouse was crowded to, this is in quotes, crowded to suffocation with men and women from all parts of the county. The case was tried before a full bench consisting of Judge Thomas, Judge Brashears, and Judge Forsyth. Now, what's interesting again is Judge Brashears was an Anne Arundel County judge, and Judge Forsyth was from Howard County, but they were all in the district. And on major cases during that day, they would often have all three would sit. So this was obviously a very large case, a serious case, and so even though they were from other jurisdictions where they resided, they actually all came to sit. It's also interesting, as Judge Forsyth is, he actually originally, when I looked into some of his history, had been born in Sykesville, and ultimately was very well known in Howard County. And again, I could go on a whole side story about that, but they were all there. The widow of the murdered man, Mrs. Brown, testified. And ultimately, one of the other interesting things is that the original indictment accused Sudler of killing Mr. Brown with a stone. And in fact, Mr. Sudler had confessed that he used a stone in killing him. But the state, the prosecutors, never really thought that that was true. So the Friday before the trial were to begin, they decided they would do an autopsy. And they found out that, in fact, he had been shot. And so at the trial, they introduced both those results as well as the gun and the ammunition, which was really fascinating because the defense found out that Monday morning as they were beginning the trial. So there was not a big emphasis on pretrial discovery back then, but it still proceeded, and it was described that the trial went and that there was a large crowd still present near midnight when they finally adjourned. So again, you can see quite the difference in the way things were done. As to ultimately the verdict, ultimately it went to the judges. The verdict was received. It says when it was received, there was a silence in the large crowd. And at that point, Judge Thomas had announced that it was a unanimous decision of the judges and they found him guilty. And ultimately, he was taken back to the jail to await the execution date for the governor. When you look at some of the articles, and you're digging this up from the past, it is, again, this was all really being derived. This was actually a photo of Solomon Sudler in his jail cell at the old jail. So you could see that this was a major issue and something that the crowds were certainly there and interested in seeing. As far as its execution, again, times were very different. His execution ultimately was on April 14th of 1916. And so we're talking between the crime occurring on New Year's Day to execution, it was merely a few months. Ultimately, as a story, as a side to this, the governor issued an order of execution for this date, which was sort of the process. The governor would pick when that would occur, and then an order would issue. The sheriff, who was Sheriff J.M. Stoner at the time, had to bring in gallows, and actually got gallows from Adams County, Pennsylvania, and had them transported down because Pennsylvania had done away with capital punishment, and therefore didn't have a need for gallows anymore. Oh, apologize, I didn't turn that off. I'll hold myself in contempt. So ultimately that was done. The description of some of what had taken place was the scaffolding was brought down. They originally had erected a fence around the rear of the jail of 16 feet high to prevent others from being able to see into and see the execution, but a crowd of 200 to 300 had gathered for the execution, and part of the fence was torn down the night before. And so ultimately they were able to watch the execution, although the crowd was described as being very solemn and quiet during the execution. He was ultimately executed on April 14th of 1916 at 6:05 a.m. He was the third person in Carroll County to be executed by hanging. The first person we were able to get some information on appeared to be June of 1859, was the name of Rebecca McCormick, who was convicted of killing a 13-year-old boy with a pitchfork and is the only woman in Carroll County to be hanged. I will tell you, when I began in this, I didn't realize that anybody had been actually sentenced and executed in Carroll County, so it was I was quite in awe that had actually been a process that had been occurring here. Now, I told you another interesting side note as I go through looking. Judge Brashears, who sat on this case, and this was a major case, he actually died a year later at 59. And Judge Thomas, who was the judge here and had been the chief judge, actually gave a very extensive eulogy to Judge Brashears at his funeral. Again, one of the interesting aspects. These were the articles, again, from the Carroll County Times describing what had taken place in 1916. And you can see, again, this was clearly a huge issue in the community. This was an interesting picture that came right after. This was draftees in front of the Carroll County Courthouse prior to leaving for Camp Meade on September 27th of 1917. They were the first Carroll County draftees that had been called into service. And this would have been the year after the Sudler case. But it gives you a bit of an insight again, I think, in how much the courthouse was the epicenter of the community. This was, by all accounts, really the heart at that time of Carroll County. I talked to you a little bit about Judge Thomas. This is Judge Thomas. As I indicated, he was the chief in the Sudler trial. He sat for both trial work and sat on the Court of Appeals. As I told you, as the chief judge for this circuit, he actually also would hear any appeals, what is now called, and was then, has always been sort of our Supreme Court in Maryland. So he sat on that as well. Now, one of the stories about Judge Thomas is he died at the age of 63 in his chambers at the courthouse in April 26 of 1924, and from what is believed to be a heart attack. Essentially, he had returned from the Court of Appeals on Friday evening, and on Saturday he was to work at his office at the courthouse. He had talked to different county officials, and when he returned to his office, he complained of pain and discomfort, which he thought was due to indigestion. He asked the court crier, Richard Owings, to go to his house and get some tablets for indigestion. Ultimately, when the crier and his wife had returned, they found the judge was suffering from intense pain and was unconscious. Physicians were called to the chambers, unfortunately unable to help him, and he died less than an hour later. The Carroll County Times described Judge Thomas as, and I quote, an esteemed citizen and able jurist. And they noted that when his death was confirmed, quote, there was a universal expression of sorrow, tributes of respect, and words of appreciation for Judge Thomas. It describes that hundreds of people from Westminster and all parts of Carroll County and from other counties attended his funeral, that businesses were suspended during the hour of the services, and all of the offices at the courthouse were closed and the building was draped in mourning. Again, it shows, I think, how central the courthouse was to the community. Now, by all accounts, it appears that he died in the anteroom, which I will show you later, which was the original chambers for the judges. So I immediately wanted to find that out to ensure it wasn't the chambers I'm in right now. But I thought that was an interesting segue to at least touch on ghosts in the courthouse. It certainly is probably no stranger to you that the historic courthouse has long been a stop in ghost tours, and a lot of discussion about that. For a period of time, it served as a hospital briefly during the Civil War. As I told you before, the poor and homeless were able to take shelter in the basement during certain really hot days or very cold and frigid days in the winter. They would cook food over small fires in the basement. And it has been reported by many, I have not had this experience, but there are people in the courthouse, and it's been reported over time, that you can often smell the aroma of food cooking, particularly chicken noodle soup, at times during the winter, that smell still can permeate. I would also say, I can't show you the video because we are restricted in being able to show video of the courthouse, interior courtroom. But I wanted to give you at least a photograph. You will see this right here. So this is one that people have sometimes accounted, and actually there was a time where a news station wanted to do a story and wanted the video about the ghost that's in the courtroom. And, the court would not turn over the video, but I will show you, here is the figure, and you will see it go in and out and go down as though it seems to be going down the walkway. This is actually courtroom 1, and that's the courtroom that I still use. Whether that's Judge Thomas, I do not know. I've not had that experience, but at least I know it wasn't in my actual chambers. All right, having said that, let's talk about this photograph in 1937. This was an interesting photograph that was done. That is the 27 members, including 4 judges and former judges. And in this photograph, it includes Judge Forsyth and Judge Francis Neal Park. In the photograph, this was everyone in the Carroll County Bar Association at the time, 1937. Now, this actually sits in my chambers, this particular exhibit. You will see here a listing of everyone who is in the photograph, along with what position they're standing in, and each of them signed it. So there's the blow-up of that. This was certainly at the 100-year anniversary of the creation of the courthouse. They did this photo. God willing, I'm still here in 2037. It is my intent to see if we can recreate that photograph for current day, but it is a fascinating look into the history. This in the middle, this is Neal Park. This was an exhibit done, again, to show that he also, Neal Park, as a judge in Carroll County at the time, was also sitting on the Court of Appeals in that dual role. And one of the things that it noted in this particular photograph in his history is that he had studied law with Chief Judge William Thomas. So that is ultimately how he sort of got into his legal career. Now, one of the fun things that we learned over time, which was actually, I think, a surprise to even those judges that had previously predated me in doing the research, is the courthouse. Oh, I forgot this photograph. This is Neal. So these books, some of which are from 1836, 1840, are literally in my office, in my chambers. They sit up on the shelves. We have many in better preserved areas, but it's one of the really difficult things is I love to see this preserved, but we don't have the areas. And so there is so much history laying all over the courthouse. This is just one example. You can see Neal Park, as one of the people that had at some point used this. One of the courthouse in movies. This was an interesting aspect. I found out when we were doing and conducting the research that the courthouse had actually been in a movie. And I was like, wow, that's fascinating. I went on, what you can do on the internet now is great. I found the movie. I actually ordered it, I bought it, and we had it brought in. So, for those that may know, this was William Brennan, who had been in a lot of movies, actually had won an Oscar for some of his work. The news articles regarding this, it described that all of the people of Westminster were excited except for the courthouse janitor, who had to fly the American flag from the cupola much lower than normal so it would fit in the camera shot. Now it transitions to a courtroom scene that is not actually the courtroom. They just did the exterior. But you can also see, when we looked, you could see that the janitor managed to get that flag into that shot. But that was interesting. Now, what was also interesting is many of the photographs from that time, obviously we had black and white. This movie was done in Technicolor. When I had discussions with Judge Stansfield, he had given me some information in the oral history of this that I didn't know, which he said, at one point, the courthouse was yellow. I was like, yellow? He said, yeah, it was painted yellow. Well, sure enough, when you see this video, and you saw, the exterior was painted, and it was painted yellow, which was an interesting way to confirm that had taken. This was one of the early diagrams drawings that we had of the courthouse, and I don't have a date for this, but you could see it was obviously done at a very different time frame. The first one that I was able to get something on was this illustrated atlas, thanks to Judge Stansfield. He pointed this out to me. This was from 1877, and this atlas was created. And what they would do is they would come around and they would do some drawings of notable buildings in the area. And so obviously they had Western Maryland College, but they had at this point the courthouse. And so again, we couldn't see the color there, but we certainly knew that in fact a general view of what it appeared at that time, and there had been some changes. This was, again, something that sits in the courthouse in my chambers. Is a picture on the back that is Judge Boylan. Judge Boylan was one of the judges who served from 1941 to 1965. So this picture was somewhere in probably the 40s. You can see again the picture of the courthouse outside on a nice snowy day. This picture around 1960, it appears though it had changed more to a white. So eventually what happened was it went from an exterior color of yellow to an actual being then painted white. And then somewhere along the way, I don't know exactly when, they said, we probably shouldn't have it painted. And so now it's down to its brick. As I assume they got tired of having to constantly repaint the brick. Is probably what happened. Now, having put us a little bit, I think you saw the original picture of the Bar Association. Well, that eventually changed, and Judge Getty was very helpful in providing some of the information and history that we were able to go and confirm. Mary Gray Clemson was the first woman admitted to the Carroll County Bar before Chief Judge James Boylan, who we just talked about in the photograph. She was admitted to the bar on April 17th of 1946. Now, in 1946, there was 11 women that had been admitted to the bar at that time, and so she had constituted about the 139th and the 150th female members of the bar overall. The entire state is what I'm referring to. So she was somewhere, when she joined the bar in Carroll County, was somewhere within the first 140 to 150 women ever admitted to the Maryland State Bar. Her father, actually, John Gray, was president of the American Bar Association in 1980. So she got into that as well. The other thing that we saw change a few years after she was ultimately admitted, and then obviously other women followed, is we had then women on the jury. This was an article that came out that the first women were selected for a Carroll County jury. They served the May term in 1957. The Carroll County Times reported in an article in May of 1957, quote, "The women got what they wanted and they made the most of it." And 7 women served on the grand jury that term, and 10 women were selected to a petit jury. In other words, when we have our normal juries, we think of 12. So they had 10 on the petit jury, and the first woman sworn in was Miss Pearl Bollinger. And they took the oath and served with James Boylan presiding. Now, this is the list and the photograph of the first women that participated in Carroll County on a jury. And so you can see that, and this will come in a bit later, but the time frame for this being around 1957. Now, I will tell you the first female judge in Carroll County was in 2001 in the district court was Judge Joanne Ellinghouse Jones. The first elected female circuit court judge was in 2018 with Judge Maria Ostreicher. We now have 7 judges. We have 4 in the circuit court and 2 in the district court. And of those judges, 3 are women that currently sit as judges in the county. Now that brings me to my next part of this, which is this jury box. So there's a very interesting story, and I, again, will credit Judge Getty with a lot of the research that had already been done on this. But I remember when we were discussing this and having found this. So this was a box. This box was in the jury room in the historic courthouse. And underneath there was a sliding area that it had been there for some time. I had never noticed it. I think it pretty much had gone unnoticed for a long time. And then this was pulled out at some point to go, look, there's this jury box underneath. And each of these boxes at the time represented election districts. So the way it would work is each of these were closed with a lock. The jury box was required at the time by statute in what it called cubiform box. Small cubes arranged around a square with lids that open from the top for each election district. Each lid had an individual lock for security of the jury selection process. When the box was originally made, it had to be between 1872 and 1888. We know that because when it was first made, the county had 12 election districts. So on the outside, you will see the 12 election districts. The square in the middle was originally all open, but 2 boxes were later added when the election districts were expanded. These 2 right here. Mount Airy in 1888 and Barrett in 1910. While other counties in Maryland used marbles for the jury selection process, Carroll County retained the use of paper ballots. So this box was mounted underneath the jury table in the jury room in the historic courthouse. This article on how juries were made, again, this was Judge Getty did a historical piece on this. So the jury selection process followed what was followed in the local newspapers. And it had been described in the American Sentinel, which was a Westminster newspaper back in 1900. There were 3 jury terms, February, May, and November. Only petit jurors were drawn in the February term. So the districts, jurors were drawn by districts with the number of jurors being based on the number of registered voters in each district. So this was a process, it was a formula. Each name was written on a slip of paper who were eligible, and it was folded and given a twist, that's the way it's described, and dropped in the box. Okay? Now, what's interesting is this process of jury selection, I don't know, and having been able to find is maybe when it stopped. But what we do know is this box, we got a locksmith to work on the locks to get it so we could open them. We had no idea what was inside. We did that just last year. And we had sort of an unveiling in the courtroom. We had all of the people that work in the courthouse that came, and we actually opened these to see what was inside. And we took turns, the various judges, we took turns opening that up. And inside, there was still paper and twisted exactly as described in that article that were still remaining inside. And when we opened them and we were looking and reading out the names, there were women that were in among the potential jurors. So we know at a minimum that it was used until after 1956, although I don't know exactly when it started, but because of those names being in there, but those names were still in there, and they still are in there, we put them back in, but really a fascinating look as to the history of how jury selection was done, and how different districts would submit people to be potential jurors and how they were randomly to be taken. So let me talk about the historic courthouse a bit. Just a note, you can see the different areas and the number of names based on the size of the election district. So that is how that would work. Talk about the historic courthouse a bit today. Courtroom 1 is the largest and main courtroom on the second floor. That's where I have the privilege of taking the bench most often. The jury room is located in the courtroom, and they're off of the courtroom, and there's a holding cell for those that are incarcerated. On the first floor, mainly, there's courtrooms 3 and 5, which I'll show you soon, that are primarily used by family magistrates. So those were eventually, over time, repurposed. They used to be used for the clerks. They used to use for the county tax office. There's health records, all kinds of things it was eventually used for. But it's used for court personnel only now. The law library is on the first floor. It is fully operational and has a lot of history there. Talk about the law library. This is a photo, and Kevin Dayhoff took a nice photo for us back in 2019. As I said, it was originally located on the second floor. It expanded to include 5 interconnected rooms that are located in the basement, the first floor, and the second floor of the east wing. The basement portion of the library ultimately was closed for flooding at some point, but this is still regularly used. It's used by self-represented litigants will come in and sometimes use that as resources and forms. We have computers available for them. It is also still used. A lot of members of the bar library will come in. It keeps a resource of different history. In there is a wealth of history. Here's just one example. So this is a safe. So when I showed you this photo, you see this right here. Originally, there was no extra room back there. It was later added. This was a safe, and this was the inside of the safe. It was metal, and it was... Eventually, when they added this extra side, they said, well, we'll just go through the safe. That'll be a doorway. And so the safe was removed as a safe, but it's still there to this day. That was where, again, you had the tax office, you had different important records in the county where they would actually make a safe. So instead of removing all of that, eventually when it was added, that's what was done. This is also a very interesting piece of history hanging in the law library. This was a deed from 1765. This ultimately was a deed that conveyed about 1,400 acres or 3 tracts that made up a lot of part of Westminster in the donation, the northeastern portion that is now the city of Westminster. So again, when you look at you just walk around and you see the history of this in there, it's pretty amazing. These are some of the different portraits. I'm going to show you some other portraits, but these are some of the portraits that are still hanging in our law library about the different judges that have served over time. Let's talk a little bit about courtroom 1. As I indicated, it's a second floor. It's a courtroom that is fully operational and that I still use on a daily basis. Now, obviously times have changed. These monitors have been added. We have a lot more need for audio-visual. This is an aspect that usually is something that is interesting to people. So originally, the layout of the courthouse, and Judge Stanfield was really great in giving me some information on this. The layout of the courthouse was originally different. The courtroom. Originally, a judge would sit over here and face out. There's double doors. This bench and this configuration was sometime after the Civil War where it was first installed as a bench and that's where the judge would then sit. But at the time, there was no security. So there was rarely ever a deputy in the courtroom, or at the time, they didn't even have bailiffs. So you can imagine when you're there and you have people, there's no metal detectors, there's nothing. People would come in and you'd have these matters be done. Well, this was an area where a judge or a trusted friend would hold the shotgun. It was this area here off to the left is an area where a shotgun would be held in case, someone didn't behave. And that just shows you a difference in the element of security at the time. Now, because of the needs have changed, one of the things that's really always very important for us in the court, and certainly for me, is when we have to do modifications, maintaining the historical nature of it. One of the things we had to do was an extension. This entire area was just built over the last year. And it looks like it's been there the whole time. It is amazing. The county had some carpenters that came in. They took incredible time, matching, staining. All of this was done because we needed additional area for clerks to sit. Now, I say it is, this whole area can all be removed. None of it went into the original desk. It is done in a way so that there was nothing that was drilled or nothing that was done in any way to affect the original bench. And that's one of the things we work really hard to do, that even when we have to make some of these changes, so all of that can just be removed, even though it looks like it's probably been there forever, but it hasn't. In courtroom 1, these are currently all the judges that are on my wall staring at me most of the time when I'm in there, and I always try to live up to what they've done before me and live up to live up to my predecessors. But we can see we have Judge Donald Gilmore, was 1977 to 1990, Judge Burns, Judge Beck, and Judge Arnold. I appeared in front of all of them as a lawyer. We have Judge Galloway, Judge Hughes, and Stansfield. Judge Hughes and Judge Stansfield are the most recent additions to the wall. Their portraits were completed, and as I've said, Judge Stansfield is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the courthouse, and is just tremendous. And I'm looking forward as we continue to work to grow this presentation. These are the Windsor chairs. These were replaced, the ladder back chairs, in 1937. So when you come in and sit in a jury in my courtroom, you're sitting in these same chairs. Now, at times we've had to repair them. We actually have a budget item, which is repairing antique furniture. And we do when we have to, but we've maintained those. There's also a lot of excess furniture elsewhere in the courthouse. These were the original chairs that were used. And we have them at this point over in the corner of the courtroom. Obviously, you can tell these probably aren't going to support everyone the same way that they might have. So we don't have them being used as much, but it is fascinating. You can look at the wear on some of these and the history on these. You will also see where people have carved their initials in it at times. It's really amazing when you go through that. This is the jury room that is off of the courtroom 1. And this is where that jury box was stored. So you can see how they would just keep it under there, and that's where it was stored. And when it was time to select for a new jury, they would pull it out and go through the process. This is the witness chair. We've had to do work over this over the years in order to get some repair. Sometimes the arm is so worn, but we still try to maintain it. This is a fabulous view. So you can imagine in the day when you had this, the double doors off of the courtroom. The judge originally was on the side of the courtroom and was looking out through that down to the Court Street. And when we talked about the town crier, what would happen is when court was ready to go into session, they would go out onto this balcony with a bell and ring the bell so it would resonate down Court Street where lawyers and everything were, to let everyone know if you had business in the court, now was the time to come. And I still would like to do that. I've thought maybe I could borrow a bell, Lynn, from Battle of the Books. But it's really amazing when you sit there sometimes and think about the history that precedes you. This is what we call the anteroom. This was originally the judge's chambers. And it was right off of, this door walks right into the courtroom. And so this entire area and the books, you can see the history in here, but this is where the judge originally, and I suspect Judge Thomas at the time, passed away. And it gives you a little bit of idea of what was in here, and it's really an incredible looking room. I now walk through that to get into the courtroom, but that originally was the judge's chambers. I bring this up because it's just interesting. You can see the time frame when some of this was done. This is the bathroom that is connected to what was the judge's chambers. And I tried to do some checking on this old Dixie cup dispenser. And it seemed to be the early 1900s. I haven't gotten it nailed down yet, but it certainly gives you some idea that these things are just sitting everywhere. It is like a history find every day at work. This again, another item that is still very much in here that was used for signing paperwork and so forth. For a long time, inside of this, they would keep a suit jacket. And a suit jacket was when someone came to court and was not presentable, they would pull it out and make them wear it while they were up. Sort of like if you ever, the places, the restaurants where you go and it's like, oh, okay, you got to wear one of their jackets. Well, that was the case now. So this will give you some insight. This is down in courtroom 3. We have what now is the magistrates. It's what ultimately is used for family law matters, some juvenile matters. But this is now what that courtroom looks like. It's still very operational and used. Originally, this was an example of it was being used for other things. Again, look at this. On this side, this is what you walk through to get into the courtroom from an area which is the judge's chambers. You're walking through, again, this safe. So, again, they left safes in both areas, and they just have it where you walk through it. So luckily, no one's been locked into one side or the other yet, but this is just a view. I wanted to give you an insight of what it looks like inside the first floor of the courthouse. And you just don't see buildings constructed like this anymore. I will tell you, while I've never had the experience of a ghost or I haven't seen anything since I've been there, because I usually get that question, I have been there at night on the weekend when I'm by myself, and you walk down there and I'm looking around, like it can look a little creepy at times, but this is something I wanted to show you that you probably never get a chance to otherwise see. So, at risk of dying, I did go up there and get some photographs for this presentation. I thought, well, that would make a good story for someone else to give this presentation. But up in the top, what you will see is, this is the top, at the very top when you see in the photographs, and you can look out through the varying windows around the courthouse. But there are names written all up in here. For example, in 1937, May of 1937, you will see all the names that are written there from people. Now, it appears as though originally, from what we could gather, and I think Judge Gedeon indicated, some of these were when people would go up and do repairs, a new roof and everything. It was sort of a way that they would document who did the work, if there was any follow-up or anything. And then after that, I've heard that members of the bar, when they passed the bar, would get a key to the courthouse, and one of their first things is they could go up and write their names. So over time, you see a lot of different names in different areas throughout, all up there. But you could see the view when you're up there, and you can imagine back in the day that this was a pretty amazing building. Now, this will also, and I know I'm getting close, but I want to touch on this. This is just to give you a sense of what it's like to be in this courthouse. So we were doing some preparation for this, and as I said, you can't go anywhere without tripping over some incredible history. So we're walking through, and there are, in the next level up, there are all kinds of items just everywhere. And over on the side, there was filing cabinets. No idea, like, what is it? What's over there? Well, here's what's over there. This is from 1924 from the health officer who is reporting from the Union Bridge District. They have 12 cases of measles. They have 4 cases of chicken pox, 4 cases of pneumonia, and 1 of scarlet fever. No tuberculosis reported. So you can see, again, just laying on the side over there is incredible history and a story to be told. Also, because this used to be the tax office, here are your tax forms that people have filled out this was 1918, but these are forms that people had filled out to report what they owned and what they have. Again, piles of them laying around. This was a really interesting thing that I did find. This was dated April 24th of 1861. It was an inquisition. And it's very times, obviously the quality of the writing has decreased as well as the writing style is very different. But it appeared as though there was different people that were testifying. The sheriff had administered an oath, and there was varying names that ultimately signed that appeared to be sort of the jury. And there had been some inquisition. It appeared to be originally there was an accident, so I think what I could gather from it is the Western Maryland Railroad was trying to acquire more property, and the question was, how much is this property worth for this person where they're trying to take the property? And ultimately they determined it was $1,600. And a lot of it is, the way it is written, is outlining like a metes and bounds about what property would be included. But again, you could take any one of these and probably spend a day on it. It's really amazing when you look at it. And it's also one of those things, again, it's just sad that some of this stuff is sitting there, and I really would love to see it preserved. Here's an example. You just see piles of things upstairs. I don't know how long it's been there, but certainly aren't using that anymore, right? Same with the books. We have so much books up there from years that obviously have been used in this county for a long time. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the courthouse and the history. Again, it's incredibly awe-inspiring when you go and you look at the history in this place. And as we begin, the idea was to start building a central area, and hopefully this PowerPoint is beginning of that. As we get these stories, we get this information, we can do some additional research, and then ultimately sort of make sure that it gets preserved. But anyway, I'm happy. I don't know where my time is. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any. Okay?
I've got a microphone here. Anyone?
Yeah. David Chambers sitting there. He was interested. Do you have any option for tours? And if so, what areas can you actually tour?
I know there's tours that have been done. I don't know that we have something specifically established, but certainly the first floor of the courthouse is open. My courtroom is open. And perhaps it's a discussion we can have. I mean, I think it's nice for the community to get a chance to see that. And maybe that's something we can try to arrange at some point.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, maybe that's a future project.
I was going to suggest if there's an anniversary coming up or something, the Historical Society would be more than willing to help make the behind-the-scenes arrangements
Sure.
For a tour.
Okay.
I know Laura would be right on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that could be an interesting idea. I think, and I mentioned in the past, I've also been interested in the idea of doing a historical case reenactment at some point. I thought could be really interesting. But yeah, we can certainly talk more about it.
Did anyone ever have to get the shotgun out?
I don't know. I would love to find that out. I will tell you there were situations where a fracas had broken out in the past. Judge Stansfield actually told me about one particular incident where they had, an incident that had occurred in the courtroom. So, yeah, I would say not everyone was always behaved. Perhaps they knew it was there and didn't get too rowdy.
I had another question. It seems to be there's a long legacy of judges having a deep respect for the history of the courthouse and the people that serve there. But is there any behind-the-scenes statute or something that sort of helps preserve those spaces in that history, or is it just because there's a culture of preserving the history? I mean, what keeps maybe the future generation, oh, we need a whole new whatever in this room?
Right. I think it's probably just the love. I mean, I think everyone that works, I think it's fair to say everyone that works actually in the historic courthouse has a deep love of the courthouse. I mean, it's hard to work in the courthouse, that historic courthouse, and not have that. Obviously, as my predecessor, Judge Stansfield, he likewise had a deep love and respect for the courthouse and is still actively involved. He not only still sits on cases, but he works extensively with the law library and preserving. And we have a lot of different discussions on ways that we can continue to preserve the legacy of the courthouse. We've looked at opportunities to try to get climate-controlled rooms so we can hopefully preserve more of this. The struggle is, obviously, we're not experts. And funding's always, an issue. So yes, I would say it's mainly just the love of the people that have worked there and a recognition of the history and the place that it has in the county.
We have discovered that we have a surplus of archival boxes that I'm sure we'd be willing to donate.
Sure. I mean, we'd love to work with, I certainly would. I said, just when you see a document from 1861, it's just laying on the shelf, it's one of those things that I would love to see. And we've had some discussions about how we could try to address some of that. It's just, I would love to see it not get lost. Anybody else?
Do you have any idea why women got the vote, but then it was so long before there were women jurors? Why is that?
Well, I think probably because the men were making the decision. And honestly, if you look at it, that's really why. Actually, at the time that women were finally allowed to participate in the jury process, you will see that there were discussions where, men were saying, well, they're not able to make difficult decisions. And it was sort of that, that discrimination at the time as to gender, and that was the mindset. So although ultimately, same arguments made as to voting, it's just, it sort of became, a slow process. So it is really, it's curious that you see it took so much longer after the right to vote, but that was really, it was like, the pushback was for those reasons, at least from what I've read in the history of that.
So sort of adding along to that question a little bit, I've been interested in John M. Snowden, who was a prominent African-American citizen. And I think he was one of the first jurors who was elected and who became a juror in 1880, according to a newspaper article I found. I was just wondering if you have any knowledge about the early African-American jurors.
I don't, and I would love to get that information. I said, it's one of the parts of this, we're sort of at our infancy in trying to get some of this. And that was another area as I went, like when I looked originally for the lynching that occurred during that time frame and figuring out what the role was, that is an area I could probably, I could spend all of my time trying to get. So any information I would love to have that would point us in the right direction. Many of it is going back and looking at the records in newspapers and reports, because our court records don't exist that way anymore. And so we have to rely on a lot of the reporting from elsewhere during the time. And I will say to that point, I can find some cases that went on appeal. So like I saw the very first case that was appealed from a trial in Carroll County. So that is another way we capture some of those old trials, so historic information, but I don't have anything other on that particular issue.
Anyone else? Judge DeLeonardo.
All right, thank you all very much.